Hi.
Hello, Mr. Tippens. Welcome to the Sophia audience. I'm here with my good friend Dan Tippens, and we're going to have a discussion about rationalism in philosophy. Why don't we do our introductions first, and then we can get started. Dan, you want to go first?
Sure. I am Daniel Tippens. I'm an NYU Medical Center employee. I work in a cancer immunology lab. And I'm also a co-founder and editor of the Electric Agora with my dear friend Dan Kaufman here.
And I'm Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. And as Dan Tippens just said, I am also a co-founder and editor of the Electric Agora. Really, the Electric Agora is a project that Dan and I conceived and created together. And it's an online magazine, I'm sure, as many people know, where we post essays and videos and short reviews and even some splenetic provocation-style pieces.
Crowd favorite, man.
Yeah, a crowd favorite, although it also gets us a little bit of flack, like my most recent one did. But today we are going to have a conversation about an essay I published not long ago on the Electric Agora called Excessive Reason, in which I argue that the mainline philosophical tradition is defined by a certain kind of rationalistic outlook, one of which I have been both in this essay and in published professional work that I've done, of which I've been relatively critical. The essay evoked enough interest, and I think you, Dan, have enough questions, criticisms, thoughts on it that I thought it would be a good idea to maybe develop the ideas further.
Yeah, that sounds good. And this will also be good because I suspect there were probably several questions that I'll have that other readers had when they read through your essay, because it's a lot to take in for kind of a newcomer to the topic. So this should be good.
Okay, and just so everybody knows, Dan is in a laboratory, and so he's periodically going to have to fiddle with things above him, or else a plexiglass shield is going to fall around him and release toxic nerve gas that will destroy every microbe in its vicinity. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in other words, you should totally pay more in taxes for this research. Otherwise,
Okay, I gotcha. So how do you think we should start? How should we get into this?
So as you said in your essay, you talk about, your title is Excessive Reason, but what you're criticizing, at least if we had to put this kind of movement in a word, is rationalism in mainstream analytic philosophy. And so I guess it'd be good to first start with what you mean by rationalism and where you see this idea being deployed in mainstream analytic philosophy.
Okay, so yes, I mean, we need to do some disambiguation because the word rationalism has more than one use in philosophy. And so I want to be very clear about what I'm not talking about. There is in philosophy a capital R rationalism, which is associated with one of the two major movements in the Enlightenment, the movement that's associated with Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. It's contrasted with the empiricist tradition, which is identified with John Locke, Bishop Berkeley, and David Hume. And that is not the rationalism I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a small r rationalism, which in my view characterizes all of mainline philosophy. And now let me say a word about what I mean by mainline philosophy, because that also needs to be disambiguated. I'm not the outlook I'm talking about really is not one you can identify with the ancient Greeks. It's not that they didn't place a high emphasis on reason, but as will become clear by the way I talk about this, theirs is a much more mixed, complex, heterogeneous sort of outlook on the human template and on human ideals. When I talk about the mainline philosophical tradition, I'm really talking about the mainline tradition of the Enlightenment. And so that would include all the characters that I just mentioned: Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, Bentham, Mill. And then I also mean by the mainline tradition the continuation of that historical tradition in the analytic philosophy tradition of the 20th century. For people who are not aware, although much of the Blogging Heads audience is very well educated and knows this already, but just for the sake of completion, after Kant in the 19th century, philosophy in the West underwent a kind of a split, a divergence of directions. And you have the beginning of what's called the continental tradition that you would identify with people in the 19th century like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer. And the analytic tradition, which you would identify with people like Bentham and Mill, and then in the 20th century with the logical positivists, the ordinary language philosophers, and then after World War II, the Quineans and all the post-Quineans. And what I'm saying is that the mainline tradition in terms of the Enlightenment and then the analytic thread that followed the Enlightenment is largely rationalistic. Something that's not true, incidentally, of the continental philosophy, of the continental, very much untrue of the continental tradition.
Yeah.
So that's the basic framework.
I was going to say, there's, in addition to just enumerating the philosophers, the famous philosophers who fall in the different traditions, there are some other ways you can classify them which might be relevant to the discussion. The one that's always struck me is what seems like a difference in methodology, in addition to subject matter, but in methodology, analytic philosophers have at least tended to emphasize complete clarity. Sometimes this means logical clarity, putting premise, conclusion out in logical form. And continental philosophers have not really adopted that as much.
Right.
They allow for much more interpretation of their text, for kind of a little bit more of an intuitive feel of what they're saying as you go along, as opposed to, so basically they're allowing the reader to kind of work through the issues with them, whereas as opposed to the analytic philosopher is telling the reader what they're getting at exactly.
Right.
And this might have relevance later because, yeah, I mean, it seems like that methodology that analytic philosophers employed might have kind of led to this kind of, or at least motivated this rationalism that you're talking about.
Or you could view it as an expression of it. The only tradition I can think of in the continental tradition that is rationalistic in the way that I'm talking about is the structuralist tradition. But that's only one slice of continental philosophy, and it's not the biggest slice. The phenomenological traditions and the post-structuralist traditions being larger, more prominent. And so, yes, it's nice that you brought that up because I actually take the logical and analytical rigor of the mainline analytic tradition to be an expression of precisely the rationalism that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So I guess then the thing I need to do now is I sort of need to sort of say what I mean, what this rationalism consists of. So why don't I go ahead and at least sort of outline a few of the key characteristics, and let me sort of be clear about what I'm going to do next. I'm going to say what I take the chief elements of the small r rationalist outlook to be. And then what I want to say is that this outlook has led to the mainline philosophical tradition idealizing certain human characteristics. That is, that out of this rationalism comes a picture of human nature, specifically of human belief and human action, that is influenced and determined by this rationalism, right? So there's going to be sort of two parts of this. What are the elements of rationalism on the one hand, and then on the other hand, what is the sort of the picture of the human ideal that follows from this rationalistic picture? So in terms of what I mean by rationalism, I mean something like this. That is that the idea that both human belief and action, in order to be deemed acceptable, must have some sort of rational justification or warrant. Okay, and so the idea is that the only legitimate reason to accept a belief is if one has rational grounds for believing it, and the only acceptable or legitimate reason for acting is if one has a rational reason for acting. And by a rational reason, what is in terms of belief, by a rational reason, what is typically meant is either some sort of empirical evidence or some sort of inductive or inductive proof. Okay. With respect to action, the idea is that our action should stem from some sort of a rational consideration. Now, that can either be some consideration of utility, right, of good outcomes, which is rational because one can tie it to a sort of a scientific picture of human nature. Bentham does that. He says that the reason why we should consider considerations of utility to be overriding is precisely because utility is a fundamental human imperative, as we're told by science. The other way of rationally justifying action is to base it in some sort of clearly logically rigorous conception of reason or right inclination, which is what Kant essentially does. Okay. Now, given this conception of the legitimate grounds of belief and action, certain things are clearly ruled out as not legitimate grounds, right? So the idea that one would believe something because of tradition, let's say, or that one should believe something because the belief is emotionally satisfying or emotionally compelling. These are ruled out by the rationalists as illegitimate sources of belief. And the idea that one should act on the basis of either sentiment or of what Edmund Burke called prejudice, by which we don't mean discriminatory attitudes in a toxic way, but prejudice in the sense of act on grounds that have a sort of a historical and a customary sort of basis. These are also considered to be illegitimate grounds for action and belief. So that's my picture of rationalism. And I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that before I talk about the ideals.
It's kind of interesting that, like, critical thinking is a course that you're taught early on in college. And I think it might inadvertently breed this kind of rationalism in its students. Because,
hold on one second. You're freezing.
Oh, okay. You there?
Okay. Yes, you froze for a moment, but just go ahead. Keep going from where you left off.
I just want to keep you on your toes, man.
Yeah.
So one thing I was just talking about critical thinking, course that you take in college, and you learn all of the fallacies, the bad forms of reasoning, and all of them include the very things that you're mentioning. The rationalist picture excludes things like argument from authority, things like argument from emotion. I mean, you can spell that out in various ways.
Ad hominem.
Ad hominem. Right. And genetic fallacy, right?
Right.
Which would include some kind of historical reasoning.
Yes.
And so, it's just kind of interesting to note that even now, at least, it seems that one of the fundamental classes you take early on in analytic philosophy training is critical thinking, which strongly condemns the use of these tools of thinking or these ways of going about believing and acting that, you've just said the rationalist criticizes.
That's right. And actually, in this case, there is, of course, a connection to the ancient world. This is precisely sort of the criticism that Socrates makes of the sophists, right? And so there is a sort of an ancient pedigree to this distinction or this divide between the idea of rational grounds for belief and action as being the sort of the legitimate grounds, and all these other sorts of kinds of reasons that are the result of either emotional appeals, rhetorical appeals, etc., as being in some sense dirty or tainted. And so, yes, I agree with you. I think that even today we are training people in philosophy to be rationalists in the way that I'm suggesting. Now, whether that's good or bad depends upon what we think of the sort of ideals that are based on this. And so maybe I should sort of say a few things about what those ideals are. Right?
Yeah. And maybe it's just worth noting quickly. One reason you might breed rationalists in philosophy and analytic philosophy is if you have a certain conception of what the goal of philosophy is. Because no one would deny, for example, that you should be rationalist about belief when it comes to scientific knowledge.
That's
which
right.
you would say. And so if you had a similar view of philosophy in terms of knowledge acquisition, of facts about the world and such, then you probably want to be a rationalist there as well.
Right. And so, that really then is the $800 question, is whether indeed the sort of rationalism which is completely appropriate within certain areas of inquiry, whether it's in a sense generalizable, right? Because one thing I'm not going to say is I'm not a romanticist, so I'm not going to reject the idea of rational grounding of belief and of action. But what I'm going to say is that that rational grounding of belief and action is appropriate in certain scenarios, but is not something that's generalizable or generally true. And more generally still, I reject the picture that ultimately reason is what is defining of human nature. I mean, because that's sort of an underlying a sort of presumption of all of this, is that human beings are defined by their capacity for reason, and that to be rational is the human ideal. And let's just be very clear before I get into the specific ideals what that means. What it really means is that, as far as mainline philosophy is concerned, truth is the ultimate end of all inquiry. Right? The reason why we engage in inquiry and why we pursue belief acquisition is to believe true things, right? To acquire knowledge. And similarly, the ultimate purpose of activity, the ultimate end of all activity, is to fulfill one's duty to the right and the good, right? And that therefore ethics winds up being ethical considerations wind up being the overriding reason for acting. So truth is the overriding reason for believing, and duty is the overriding reason for acting. So those two fundamental, in my view, ideas about the purpose of inquiry and activity come out of this rationalist picture. And they do, in my view, imply a number of what we might call virtues, right? Distinctive rationalist virtues. So one of these is disinterestedness, right? So the idea that we should be impartial in both our beliefs and our conduct is a very strong idea in mainline philosophy. That is that in inquiry, we should go wherever the evidence leads. We should not prejudge anything or come to inquiry with any preconceived notions. And in action, we ought to be always equitable and fair in the way that we deal with everyone around us. So that's one ideal or virtue that comes out of the rationalist picture. Another one, and it's very closely related, is dispassionateness, right? That the ideal state of a person is one of relative dispassion, because only if one is dispassionate can one unproblematically pursue the truth without adulteration and pursue the right and the good without adulteration. A third ideal is autonomy, and the idea there is that we can only be free when we're not bound by externals, right? So when we're not bound, if we're bound by custom or tradition or habit, or sentiment, we're viewed in the mainline tradition as not really being free. This is most associated with Kant, but to a lesser degree, other people like Bentham and Mill are going to want to say this also. And a fourth virtue is consistency and fairness. And so what this means, and this I think follows from disinterestedness and dispassion, and one of the main things that follows from consistency and fairness being a virtue is that inconsistency is one of the biggest faults that one can have, right? To be inconsistent in one's belief or to be inconsistent in one's treatment of others is to violate this principle of this ideal of consistency and fairness. And then finally, I believe that the rationalist outlook entails a kind of perfectionism, both an epistemic perfectionism, that is, that we seek to have rational grounds for all of our beliefs, not just some of them, and a kind of moral perfectionism, that we always strive to to obey duty above all else, right? Above every other consideration. That notion that duty is overriding is a kind of perfectionism. So these are what I take to be the ideals that follow from the rationalist picture. This is what I take to be the sort of the view of human nature and of what the ideal human being is. And as you know, and as I said in the essay, I have a lot of problems with a lot of these ideas, and so we can then get to those. But I'm assuming you have questions or thoughts about these ideals that I've laid out.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, just one quick comment. I'm not exactly sure if this is going to bear too much relevance, but I thought it at least might be worth bringing up. There's this new topic that's coming up in epistemology, which is the topic of moral encroachment on knowledge. That's what it's called.
Explain that, because the audience may not know what it means.
Moral encroachment on knowledge. So the idea is there are certain times when we're trying to acquire beliefs about the world, true beliefs about the world, where the content of the belief could be morally hazardous. So, for example, you might ask a question like, is there such a thing as a racist, empirically true belief, right? So
you mean like the bell curve, that sort of thing?
Right, yeah. So or something like, we can take a much more simple example, something like, let's say we find evidence that contained within, Hispanic genes or something, there's evidence that there's a gene for like lesser intelligence or something like that, okay? And the idea is here, most of us would not want to, we almost don't want to endorse that belief, even if all of the evidence were to point in that direction.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's kind of a morally hazardous belief to have, right? It could be wielded in terrible moral ways and just have some morally problematic implications.
Right.
And so the idea is, with moral encroachment, the idea is when you kind of run moral risks in acquiring beliefs, the amount of evidence that you need before you can believe that evidence is supporting a specific potential, like, morally hazardous conclusion, that amount of evidence is greater. Like, the threshold of evidence that you need before you can claim knowledge about a certain claim kind of is increased. And I guess so this is kind of a case where the epistemic and the moral norms kind of conflict, right? Where they come into conflict. And so I guess maybe one of my questions for you would be like, what do you think the rationalist would say about something like this, where the ideal of action and the ideal of belief kind of come into conflict? Where, you know what I mean? I'm just curious.
I mean, those are it's an interesting case, and I mean, you don't have to hypothesize. I mean, back in the 90s, Charles Murray and I forget the other guy's name, Herenstein or something like that, wrote this book called The Bell Curve that purported to give social scientific evidence that American blacks are worse off than whites in terms of intelligence, right? Yeah. And this created a huge firestorm. As it turns out, it's not quite the best case in the world, because an awful lot of question was raised about the empirical validity of the thesis, about the quality of the data, about the inferences that they drew from the data. And so there wasn't a clear example of where there was overwhelming consensus that the empirical case had been made, and the problem was just that we're skittish about saying it. I do think, however, that you're right in the sense that the rationalist ideal does have the potential for a kind of internal conflict.
Yeah.
Not just between, let's say, belief and action, as in the case of that you just mentioned. Given that what we believe is true, is that going to lead us to do bad things, right? But also even just within the realm of action, right? So you see these sorts of moral purists cutting each other to pieces through these sort of intramural sort of quarrels. So I'm thinking, for example, of the recent dust-up between hardcore feminists and trans rights activists over Caitlyn Jenner and over, co-ed bathrooms. And, there were actually a number of very committed, very venerable old guard feminists who sort of balked at this, and they were absolutely savaged by the trans activists for whom doing right, being right with regard to trans issues was more important than being right with regard to feminist issues, and vice versa. And so I think that it's always a danger with any kind of perfectionism that it really makes any kind of accommodation very, very difficult, right? Because the perfectionism pulls you so strongly in a single direction that if you have, because we're complex, if there's more than one thing that you're perfectionist about, there's the danger that it may pull you in opposite directions. And the perfectionism really prevents you from sort of qualifying and compromising so that you can accommodate both. I also think it has problems. It has problems for political coalition building. And actually, in the most recent provocations piece that I published, I get at this a little bit. The sense in which political coalitions can be pulled apart because of a certain kind of perfectionism on the part of the people inside them, and so I think that what you're describing is very real. It's a very real, and it's an example where what might seem like a very abstract point, that is about rationalism and perfectionism, you can really see the actual manifestation of how that abstract point really has real cash value, real consequences.
Right. Yeah. So maybe you might want to talk about how rationalism kind of plays out in ethical philosophy and political philosophy and epistemology more specifically, and then we can start getting some of the maybe disagreements that you and I have on this issue.
Right. Okay. So that's great. So let me give you an example of each. So I'm going to give an example of the way that rationalism plays out in epistemology. I'm going to give an example of the way that rationalism plays out in ethics, and I'll give an example of the way that rationalism plays out in political philosophy. Right. So in epistemology, you actually you see the consequences of the rationalism in the very nature of the discipline. Right. The overwhelming amount of work in epistemology that's been done in the mainline tradition has been the attempt to give some account of rational warrant, right? Of what it means to justify a belief, of what knowledge consists of, right? And this inevitably winds up centering focus upon what constitute rational reasons, right? And so you have foundationalists, you have empiricists, you have internalists, you have externalists, you have all these positions all over the map. You have the fights over the Gettier case, over the so-called Gettier cases. But if you actually ask, well, what is this all about? What are all these arguments and what are all these fights and what are all these papers about? They're all about trying to give an account of what constitutes rational grounds for believing something. Do you need to go for a second? They all about ultimately what constitutes the rational grounds for believing something. There is a very small minority tradition in there's a small minority group within that tradition that wants to talk about the limits of reason, that wants to talk about the extent to which rational justification is in a sense contained within a larger sphere of non-rational consideration that is probably most famously associated with Hume, right? But this is a minority position, and it's one that has even less representation in the contemporary analytic tradition than it had in the Enlightenment, right? When it wasn't just Hume, there were others like Thomas Reid and the whole Scottish naturalist tradition that went this way. In the 20th century, the only person I can think of who really accepts this idea of serious epistemic limit is Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein. Okay, so that's a brief word about how rationalism is manifested in epistemology. It's manifested in that it sort of defines the subject, right? In ethics, rationalism is manifested.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So there are typically three dominant views I've been familiar with in epistemology: the coherentist, the foundationalist, and the infinitist. And typically, coherentism. So I guess we should spell these out. The idea is something like the foundationalist believes that all justification derives from a kind of a foundation of axiom beliefs upon which you justify all further beliefs. But the foundational beliefs themselves are not further justified by more beliefs. They're the foundation. They're where justification begins and kind of, in a sense, where it stops, right?
Right.
The coherentist holds that justification for belief resides in a set of beliefs cohering with one another. So the idea is, your belief is justified if and only if it coheres with your set of beliefs that you have about the world. The rest of your beliefs you have.
The other justified beliefs.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And then infinitism, which is the definitely the least popular view, is the view that justification does go on forever. Meaning there is always a further belief to justify any particular belief, and justification never ends; it infinitely goes down.
Right.
And I think there are only a couple of people who actually buy into infinitism nowadays. But the idea is most people have gone for coherentism and foundationalism precisely because they find infinitism to be untenable.
Right.
And the reason they find it untenable is because their thought is it's almost like a reductio, right? An ad infinitum argument. And usually an ad infinitum argument that something goes on ad infinitum is a reductio or a problem for a position, right? Yeah. And the idea is the infinitist holds that justification just never ends. It goes on forever. Yeah. And so the foundationalists, the coherentists, they aren't happy with this. That seems not plausible. And so they take two positions to circumvent this problem. The foundationalist says justification bottoms out. The coherentist says you don't have an infinite amount of beliefs justifying one another. You have a coherent little circle.
Right.
And so I guess what I wanted to ask was, do you think so? If it's the case that most philosophers are foundationalists or coherentists, is it the case that that's inconsistent with them being rationalists?
No. I think both foundationalism and coherentism are rationalist positions. Neither of them accepts the idea that we should accept beliefs that have no justification. And we have to be very careful about how we characterize the foundationalists, because the way you characterize them actually is consistent with some of the things that the later Wittgenstein says in Uncertainty, who is definitely not a rationalist by any stretch of the imagination. It's important to understand that for the foundationalist, the basic beliefs, the foundational beliefs, require no external justification. That is, they don't need to be inferred or evidenced by appeal to anything else. But that said, it is not the case that they are held non-rationally. That is, the reason they don't require external justification is because they have some kind of internal justification. And typically this takes the form either of saying that they're indubitable, or that they're incorrigible, or that they're infallible, or some variation thereupon. They have a special status. That is, they're so rational, they're so obviously rational that they don't require any further appeal. That's sort of the idea. And this, of course, most famously is Descartes' position. Yeah. That he articulates in the first two meditations of the Meditations of First Philosophy. So I want to make very clear, both the foundationists and the coherentists are rationalists in the sense that I described. They're not going to say that a belief is legitimate unless it is rationally warranted. They simply differ as with regard to what the structure of that rational warrant looks like. For the foundationalist, that structure is ultimately linear, and for the coherentist, it's holistic, right? But both cases, what they're talking about is rational warrant, and thus they fall within the broad rationalist picture that I've drawn.
Yeah, good. Okay, then let's move on.
Okay, so with regard to ethics, the way that rationalism is manifested in ethics is You can see it in two ways. First of all, you can see it in the dominant theories. Okay, so the dominant theories in philosophy, in ethics, are utilitarianism and some version of Kantian deontology. Right, these are the dominant positions. I'm not saying there aren't any others, but this probably makes up for 90% of the ethicists. Virtue ethics is making a comeback, has been for a few decades now. But I'm not under the impression that the hegemony of utilitarianism and Kantian deontology has been broken. And so both Kantianism and utilitarianism are rationalist moral theories in that they offer and demand rational grounds for our conception of duty, right? Right, so they both give a rational theory, a theoretical explanation of what duty consists of. For the utilitarian, duty consists of being obedient to the demands of utility, that is, human welfare, right? And in the case of the Kantian, it's rationally grounded in a notion of the rational, autonomous, free will, right? They are also rationalistic. They also are rationalistic in that they entail precisely the perfectionism that I take to be one of the rationalist virtues, right? The moral perfectionism that I take to be one of the rationalist virtues. And so both the Kantian and the utilitarian think that duty is overriding. That is that whenever we are considering how we should act, the moral consideration is always the overriding consideration. So the moral consideration for the utilitarian and the Kantian cannot be overridden, or should not be overridden, by considerations of practicality, by considerations of personal relationship, by any sort of, right? This is why they both have a very strong emphasis on disinterestedness in moral judgment, right? Right. So when I go about deciding how I ought to act, I can only act upon what reason tells me my duty is, and shouldn't act upon any other consideration. So if duty tells me, as the utilitarian says, that it's better to help 5 people than to help 1, all other things being equal, okay, then the fact that the 1 is my daughter should be irrelevant to my consideration as to how to act. The utilitarian is very clear about this. And similarly with the Kantian,
with some minor exception, obviously, because the only reason I say it's not a big deal, but for example, the utilitarian, if you had to choose between saving your daughter or saving another stranger, a utilitarian could come up with some story about how it's worse if you don't save your child because of the pain that it brings to you, in addition to the death of that.
Right, but notice something. I mean, that's it's true that the utilitarian may not always decide that the right thing to do is to not help my daughter, right? Notice I said all other things being equal, right? But the point just is that what you're required to do is what the utilitarian calculus decides is the right thing to do, right?
Yes.
And it seems to me a lot of the times when the sorts of objections that I would raise against the utilitarian are raised, hey, it's ridiculous to say that I have a bigger duty to 5 strangers on the other side of the planet than I have to my own daughter. The utilitarian, if they're unwilling to sort of bite the bullet and grip that absurdity, they oftentimes try to sort of come up with some way of construing the helping your daughter as what utility really demands anyway, right? And I always find that, I don't want to call it sort of special pleading, but I always find that to be rather unconvincing, at least ad hoc. The point is, look, if you have a moral theory that tells you that there is one supreme good, as both Kant and as both the Kant and the utilitarian tell us, the utilitarian tells us that there's one supreme good, one thing that's supremely valuable, right? And that's happiness. The Kantian tells us that there's one thing that's supremely valuable, and that's the autonomous individual rational agent. If you have a theory that says that one thing is supremely good, then you're never going to be able to justify any other value or consideration overriding it. That's why, sure, plenty of utilitarians and Kantians are going to say, oh, well, no, I don't mean that, I don't mean that, I don't mean that. But my reply always is, well, you have to think that if you're actually a Kantian or a utilitarian. Now, if you're telling me you're not one, or that you're some hybrid or adulterated version of something, then that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who actually mean it. Mm-hmm. People who actually mean it when they say they're utilitarians. People who actually mean it when they say that they're deontologists. Not people who don't mean it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess what I'm saying is I don't see how the utilitarian or the Kantian avoids moral perfectionism. And I don't see how they avoid the idea that moral duty is always overriding, right? I mean, that to me seems to be straightforwardly entailed by their outlooks. So that's where I see rationalism, how I see rationalism playing out in the ethical sphere. And it's also, do you want to say something about that before I go into the political?
Yeah, really quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that's always almost bothered me a little bit about decision theory in philosophy. I'm not sure if you've read, Philosophy of Decision Making. Did I just freeze? Did you hear what I was saying?
Everything's fine.
Cool.
You're talking about like von Neumann and prisoner's dilemma sort of scenarios and these kind of things.
So I'm talking about things like we can say with things like prisoner dilemma type things, but there's also, the thing I was reading about more recently was what's called moral uncertainty, the field of moral uncertainty. So what do you do when you don't know what to do? And one thing I've noticed is essentially in decision theory, a big problem comes up with whether or not how to make or whether or not certain values are commensurable. So, and this I feel like comes in a little bit here. So commensurable meaning you can put them on the same scale so that you can actually decide which one should motivate you more than another, right? And this comes in here in this discussion because, one thing you're talking about is how moral considerations override, or moral reasons override, moral values override non-moral values.
That's right.
And what the notion of overriding here assumes, I think, that these kinds of values are commensurable, that you can measure them, right? That the moral reasons are always more valuable or more important than the aesthetic values or some other kinds of values. And so there's actually a commensurability assumption being brought into the notion of overriding.
Yeah.
And I guess I haven't thought about commensurability of values too much, but I at least am not completely certain all the time that these values are commensurable.
I agree with you entirely. There's a really good essay by Thomas Nagel called On the Plurality of Values or something like that. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the links.
Yeah.
W.D. Ross also thinks that there's a multiplicity of intrinsic values. And W.D. Ross is an example of a non-Kantian deontologist, and he's one with whom I actually have quite a bit of sympathy. I agree. I think that the kind of the rationalism that I'm describing does in ethics entail a kind of monochromatic conception of the supreme good. In other words, there is one supreme value. It's clear. It's unambiguous. And thus, for the Kantian and for the utilitarian, there really shouldn't be any real moral dilemmas, right? That is, within the sphere of morality, there should be no moral dilemmas. And certainly, there should be no even question, right, of whether a moral value should have to compete with a non-moral value. But I agree with you that even within the realm of moral value, the rationalist has a problem, because it seems, at least in a lot of cases, that there are more than one things that are intrinsically valuable. which not both of which can be served by an action, right? And it's a credit to people like Ross, and this is the sense in which I think someone like Ross is not a rationalist. So he says when those sorts of clashes come up, really all you can do is muddle through. That ultimately the decision, the judgment that gets made is considered, but it can't be deemed rational in the way that the rationalist wants, right? So I agree with you that there is even a problem simply within the sphere of moral obligation of whether what's overriding is clear, right? But in the essay, and what I'm talking about, really what I'm talking about is the question of whether moral values should have to compete with other non-moral values, like, for example, as you mentioned, aesthetic values, or much more commonly, prudential ones, right? And so this is something that I'll get to when we talk about the criticisms of rationalism. But I agree with you that there is even a problem within the sphere of purely moral obligation, whether or not whether or not there is just one supreme value, and if not, if there's a multiplicity of intrinsic values, whether they're all commensurable with each other, or whether they conflict and clash and diverge and all that sort of thing. So.
Yeah. Okay, you may continue to.
All right. So political philosophy. This will be relatively quick. So in political philosophy, the rationalism that I'm talking about is manifested in the dominant, and in this sense, it's overwhelmingly dominant, political theoretical paradigm in mainline philosophy, and that is the social contract tradition. Okay, and I'm going to talk about it as most clearly and characteristically manifested in mainline philosophy in John Locke and in John Rawls. Okay. So John Locke, we're talking about the Second Treatise of Government, and John Rawls, we're talking about a theory of justice. And in both cases, the answer to the question, what should be our political arrangement, right? What sort of political system should we have, right? Is answered by appeal to what a rationally interested person would choose. Okay. Where that person is characterized in complete abstraction from any of the specifics of his or her actual circumstances. So for Locke, we're supposed to imagine someone in a hypothetical state of nature, which is it's very important to make clear, is not some historical time. When Locke talks about the state of nature, he's not talking about when we all lived in trees, right? And threw rocks at each other. He's talking about a hypothetical state of affairs in which we imagine there is no civil society or state, in which there is no public authority. Right.
In other words, it's a thought experiment.
Right. It's a thought experiment. Right. And the idea is that within that abstract framework, we can clearly identify what a hypothetical person would rationally choose. Right. And the idea is that given that we are both by nature rational and self-interested, what we would choose is some measure of cooperative shared governance. Okay?
Yeah.
Rawls does something very similar. I mean, there are important differences, but there's something very similar. What Rawls says is the way that we determine what the right political arrangements are is by asking what a person in a so-called original position would choose. Where the original position is one in which one is ignorant of what one's actual situation, in the society will be. So you don't know whether you're going to be poor or whether you're going to be rich. You don't know whether you're going to be well-positioned or poorly positioned. And the question then is, what would a person rationally choose in such a situation? And Rawls says clearly what a person would choose rationally in such a situation is some sort of moderate welfarism.
Yeah.
Because one doesn't know whether one's going to wind up on top or on the bottom, and so one is going to...
They'll take an impartial stance.
That's right.
For self-interested reasons.
That's right. And you see the similarities between the two ways of going about it, between the Lockean way and the Rawlsian way. And what's important to notice is that in both cases, the sole legitimate basis upon which to decide what sort of politics we should have is on the basis of what a completely abstractly conceived rational agent would choose.
Yeah.
And that to me is just, that is the quintessential example of rationalism. It is indeed what gave us the liberal democracies that we have in the West to a large extent. This sort of these sorts of theoretical considerations. John Locke's Secretaries of Government is the single most influential document on the American founding.
Yeah.
And Rawls is by far the most influential contemporary political philosopher. It's worth noting that this is not the only way that one can arrive at the conclusion that a liberal democratic polity is best. Edmund Burke, who is widely known as being the sort of the grandfather of conservative political philosophy, himself was essentially a liberal Democrat. I mean, he was in favor of the American Revolution. He supported the American Revolution. But the way that Burke arrives at the conclusion that liberal democracy is the best form of government is not through the considerations of what an abstractly conceived rational person would choose, but rather in terms of the historical arc of the West. That is, he grounds it in what he views as various inheritances that go all the way back to Magna Carta, as opposed to something that's determined on the basis of abstract rationalistic considerations. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's how rationalism is manifested in the political sphere.
Right. So what's interesting is in the political philosophy case of the Rawls and Locke and State of Nature, the conclusion that they get to from deploying essentially what they want is fairness, right? At least Locke, or I'm sorry, at least Rawls. So the whole purpose behind the veil of ignorance,
right,
is so that you'll be impartial, so that you'll come up with basically pretty fair laws.
Right, because if you don't know what your position is going to be, in the abstract, you're going to choose whatever it is that maximizes your chance of doing all right. Right, once the sort of the thing is in place. I would say that Locke is less concerned with fairness in that regard, but not because he approaches the question from a non-rationalistic perspective, but more because his construal of the abstractly characterized rational person is a somewhat different construal.
What I was gonna ask though is so at least one thing that isn't frequently objected to Rawls, I think, is something like, well, probably is, knowing philosophy, but most people like the conclusion, at least. They like the idea that you get impartiality in politics, in law, right, in policy.
Right.
And so I guess my question to you would be, do you think that this is a place where impartiality and fairness should be sought after, specifically in policy draft? Because I know, by the way, you have said you're not eschewing completely this idea of being fair in certain situations. Right. And so I'm wondering if maybe, essentially, I'm wondering if political philosophy is actually a place where rationalism could get some purchase for you, essentially. Yeah. Just like rationalism gets purchase in scientific inquiry.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so let me say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, the main criticism of Rawls that you get from people like Sandel and other communitarians is very highly theoretical, in the sense that what they basically object to, what they basically say is that you can't ascribe beliefs or attitudes or positions to a completely abstractly conceived person, right? In other words, they reject that.
Yeah.
In a sense, they reject the thought experiments as even really being possible, right?
Yeah. Or as telling us anything informative.
Right. I suspect, though, someone like Michael Sandel, who's one of the main communitarian critics of Rawls, I suspect agrees largely with the sort of welfareism, the sort of the public welfareism, that redistributionism that Rawls comes to.
And most people would. That's why it was so attractive when it and so.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about it that's sort of seductive. One wonders, did he simply start with what he already wanted to conclude and then sort of find a way to get there, or is this really where your inquiries lead you? I mean, that's a whole separate criticism. There's a very, very good, I think probably the best criticism of Rawls I've ever read, is actually a review that the philosopher Alan Bloom wrote when Theory of Justice first came out, and if I can find it, I'll link to it. But he accuses Rawls of this. Says that Rawls starts out assuming a basic redistributionist liberalism, and then sets about finding it. Right. Now, in terms of what you've asked me, however, yes, for example, so something like impartiality, I take to be an absolute virtue, for example, in the law, right? Because of what we seek the law to do, what we have law for. My problem is with when it gets applied, and in my view, misapplied in other areas. So, what's a virtue in a courtroom might not be a virtue in deciding how I'm going to act with regard to my daughter's application to universities, or my daughter's competing for a spot in the school play. Right? I'm going to do all sorts of things to advantage her in those competitions that would be completely inappropriate and bad if it was done in a courtroom, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and so, yes, of course, I think that in the sphere of law, in much of the sphere of politics, impartiality and fairness is a virtue. I don't think that that's generalizable across action generally, across all our actions. And I would also say that and this maybe is something, a critique we probably won't go into, just because it's going to take too much, and it's probably the one that with people will be least familiar. But I agree with Burke that it's better to arrive at the liberal democratic idea in the way that he does, as opposed to the way the rationalist does. Because one of the and this is manifested not just in Burke's masterpiece, which is his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Because interestingly, Burke was a supporter of the American Revolution, but an opponent of the French Revolution. And part of it was precisely because he thought the French Revolution was entirely theory-driven in a way that the American Revolution was not. And it's also manifested in a very important paper written after the Second World War by Michael Oakeshott called Rationalism in Politics, which I will link to. The problem is that, as you know, one can rationally justify a lot of stuff. On the one hand, rational warrant is a very, very strict master. But on the other hand, you can rationally deduce crazy shit, right? Stuff that you only recognize as crazy when you take the reasoning hat off for a minute and allow your sort of common sense and your instincts and your intuitions to work. Some of the most crazy ideas are the results of theories. And some of the worst ideologies are the results of theories. And so both Oakeshott and Burke argue that a kind of acceptance of a cumulative organic tradition tempered by a moderate amount of reason is the ideal way, is the best way to sort of go about determining political arrangements, which after all aren't only concerned with what's just in an abstract sense, but with a certain kind of social continuity and stability, right? Yeah. In which I would argue non-rational concerns come into play. And so, yes, I do accept the idea, the long-winded road back to what you originally asked me. I, of course, accept the idea that ideals, that virtues like consistency and fairness and impartiality are absolutely essential. in the law and in certain dimensions of politics, one man, one vote, that kind of thing. But I don't think that can be generalized. I don't think that consistency and fairness and impartiality are generalizable virtues. And I also don't think that the best way at arriving at political systems is through a purely rational / theoretical investigation.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Gotcha. Okay.
So should we now talk about some of the criticisms? I mean, or did you want to first? I mean, we're at an hour. I figured we can go an hour and a half without abusing people. Glenn Lowry had a recent one with kind of Friedersdorf, where he went like almost 2 hours. So I feel like I've been freed up to not watch the clock so tightly. But did you want to make a few observations, or did you have some thoughts before we went on to discuss what I take the main criticisms of this sort of rationalism to be?
I think we should go on to the criticisms, because most of what I might want to say now would probably be better said after you go through the criticisms.
So your disagreements probably arise a lot with respect to some of the criticisms that I've...
Yeah, I think so. At
least that's what it seems like in the conversations we've had, is that...
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one... So let's go in the same order, right? So we first talked about epistemic rationalism, small r, epistemic rationalism, and what's wrong with it. And here I suspect we probably will have the least disagreement. I suspect that the most is going to be with respect to the moral rationalism, and I think we'll probably just not talk about the political rationalism at all, for sake of time. I'm sure it'll come up in the discussion thread, and I'll be able to fill in if people want to talk about that.
Yeah.
So my criticism of the epistemic rationalism that you find in mainline philosophy is essentially a combination of the criticisms of Hume and of the later Wittgenstein, and specifically I'm thinking of the Wittgenstein of On Certainty, which is his major work in epistemology. There are epistemological ideas and criticisms and notions running through the investigations, running through all of his later philosophy. But On Certainty is the book he wrote about it. He didn't actually write a book. These are notes that were collected and put together after he died. And let me try and give a very tight and relatively brief account of what this objection is, and that is, it is not just the case that one can't give a rational ground for every belief, but to think that one can is actually to misunderstand what the giving of reasons involves. Okay, in other words, the very practice of giving, the notion of giving a reason for a belief, is one that presupposes a number of things that, if you understand what they are, you would see right away that it's impossible for all human belief to have rational ground. So let me let me talk about that for a second. So, at the most bare bones abstract level, you already raised this yourself with respect to the infinitist. Okay, if you ask me for a rational reason for some belief, let's call the belief P. Yeah, so why do you believe P? And I give you some rational reason. I give you a reason. Let's call it R. So the reason to believe, the justification for P is R. R, of course, is simply some other belief. And now the question is, well, what's your rational reason for believing R?
Right.
And the answer is going to be, well, some further belief, Q. In other words, the idea that we'd be able to give a reason for all of our reasons, on the surface, immediately is problematic, because you can see that this entails a kind of infinite regress. Now, this is precisely what the foundationalist and the coherentists try to alleviate. They try to remove this problem.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that both foundationalism and coherentism have significant substantial problems. That is, the foundationalist especially has significant problems. The coherentist has other problems. I'm not going to go into what all of them are. That take us too far off. But it's hardly the case that people are satisfied that we have found some ultimate rational ground for all these rational grounds that we give. So that's the first thing to sort of to note, that the very notion of giving reasons presupposes that we should be able to give reasons all the way down, and it seems that that's not clear that that's the case. There's also the further observation that many of the reasons we give only count as reasons if we take other things if we already take other things as being given or taken for granted. And so I'm trying to think of an example. So Crispin Wright has several papers in which he introduces a construction that he calls the 1, 2, 3 argument. And essentially what he's trying to show is that the rationalist attempt to overcome various skeptical doubts, and of course what the skeptic is doing is saying that you can't give rational reasons for everything that we believe. What Wright wants to show is that a certain kind of understanding of rational grounds can't be correct. This notion that rational grounds go all the way down and that you don't ever need to assume anything as given, right, without grounds. And so let's take an example. So let's say you observe, you watch somebody kick a ball through 2 goalposts, right? And you construct the following. You have the belief as a result that a soccer match is taking place. And so the belief is a soccer match is taking place. And so what's the rational ground? Well, the rational ground is, I saw this guy kicking a ball through 2 posts. He has therefore just scored a goal. And on the basis of this, I have rational grounds for believing that a soccer game has taken place. And what Wright wants to say is that the reasons that I've given for the belief only count as reasons if I already have independent reason to think that a soccer game is taking place. Because, of course, a ball going through 2 posts only counts as evidence of a goal if one is playing soccer. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, suppose that, one is in a strange culture in which this is how marriage ceremonies are performed. Mm-hmm. Then kicking a ball through 2 posts would not constitute a rational reason for thinking a soccer game is taking place. It would constitute a reason for thinking a wedding is taking place. Mm-hmm. And Wright's point is that a lot of times the rational grounds that we give themselves presuppose that we already know a bunch of things. Right? We presuppose that a bunch of things are already held in place. And this takes me over to Wittgenstein and uncertainty. What Wittgenstein says is, you can't even. Sorry.
So in the soccer case, what's being presupposed is that we're in the culture such that shooting a ball through 2 posts is indicative of a soccer game taking place. Stuff like that, right? Like global background information that would make your justifications kind of warranted.
Right, right. But the point being,
use a kind of abductive inference to the best explanation in the first place.
Yeah, but the relevant point here is simply that the rationalist picture that, I have a belief and then I give a reason, and the reason is a rational ground on which basis of which one can somehow infer the belief in question. What this shows is that that sort of misunderstands how reasoning works. Something only counts as a reason for something else against a background of a bunch of information that itself is simply taken as given, right?
This is a bit like Duhame's thesis in philosophy of science.
Yes, and in this case, exactly. And in this case, what Wright is showing is that in this case, what has to be presumed is precisely the thing it is that you're trying to rationally justify, right? You're supposed to be rationally justifying your belief that a soccer game is taking place. But the things that you're citing as the rational grounds, the evidence you're citing, only counts as evidence. Only counts as evidence if one already has independent grounds for thinking a soccer game is taking place. Otherwise, balls going through posts is not evidence of soccer being played. Right? It's only evidence of soccer being played if you have independent reason to think that soccer is being played. Now, I mean, it's a superficial example. It's just designed to give you a sense of the structure. This is the conclusion this is what Wittgenstein draws from this. He says the very practice of giving reasons, or the very possibility of making certain kinds of mistakes, only arise if one already is within a rich framework of already established things. He gives this analogy. He says, in order for the door to move, the hinges have to stay put. Mm-hmm. If the hinges are moving also, the door can't be moving. What it means to move is to move relative to a fixed point. So if you ask me, well, why should I think there's a fixed point? The answer, there is no answer. The only answer you can give is, well, that's the only way in which saying things move is intelligible, as if some things are fixed, right? He gives the question, this arises, Wittgenstein works in very aphoristic ways, and so he doesn't really construct arguments. He gives asks these questions that are sort of pregnant with the ideas he's trying to propose. He says, look, is it the same thing to ask? So I can ask someone, is there a planet outside the orbit of Pluto? Right? That's a perfectly legitimate question, and we know how we'd go about answering it, right? Here's a superficially similar looking question. Are there any planets at all? Or why should I think there are any planets? Now, superficially, this looks like the same kind of question, and it looks like a question for which you'd give a rational, same kind of answer. But of course, that's a very different kind of question. That, indeed, is a skeptical question. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't answer it in the same way. And notice something. You couldn't ask the first kind of question unless you presume the answer to the second kind of question. In other words, it wouldn't be intelligible to ask whether there's a planet outside of the orbit of Jupiter unless one presumed that there were such things as planets, right?
Yeah.
And so we can only ask certain questions if a number of other things are held fast. Now, this might look superficially like a kind of foundationalism, right? The things that hold fast are the basic beliefs. The problem is that, first of all, they have no internal justification like the foundationalist wants them to have. They're not incorrigible. They're not indubitable. They're not infallible. That's number one. And number two, which things hold fast, which beliefs hold fast, is going to depend upon the inquiry, right? So let me give you another example. One of the things that has to hold fast if one is engaged in any scientific investigation are the rules of logic. Mm-hmm. Right? Scientists are constantly making modus ponens inferences, which means they have to presume that modus ponens is a valid form of inference. So when you're engaged in scientific inquiry, modus ponens holds fast, right? But if I'm engaged in metalogical inquiry, if I'm doing logical meta theory, then right, part of what my job is to show that modus ponens is true. Mm-hmm. Now, in that inquiry, modus ponens doesn't hold fast. But notice, something else does. Mm-hmm. The tools and mechanics of metalogic hold fast, right? And so the reason why the position that I'm describing is an anti-rationalist and not a foundationalist position is because, A, all reasoning ultimately depends upon a whole number of things being held without reason. Those things cannot be construed as rational in the way the foundationalist wants to be because they're really held without reason. They have no internal necessity, right? And what that set of things consists on shifts and changes and varies depending upon the inquiry. Right? And so for Wittgenstein, and this is also somewhat true of Ryle. I mean, you can read this, you can see this in Ryle's, essay on knowing how versus knowing that. Right? This is another way of sort of saying a similar thing, and that is, the rationalist thinks that all believing should have a rational ground. Right? That all, more general than that, all practices should have a rational ground. And what Ryle's point is that giving rational grounds is itself a kind of practice that can be done well or poorly. And so it can't be that all practices have rational grounds. In a sense, practices come first, and reasoning is just one kind of practice. And that's, I think, the lesson sort of that I take from Wittgenstein and from people like Ryle, that reasoning is just one of many kinds of practices we engage in. And the rationalists attempt to sort of view it as sort of like the meta, overarching, overriding practice that, in a sense, is in some way internally self-justified or demonstrably internally rational, is simply unsustainable. Right? That's the sort of the criticism of.
Okay, so let's note that one thing you said earlier is that you're happy for rationalism to be kind of the predominant methodological view for certain fields of inquiry. And the paradigm example you would give is scientific inquiry.
Right.
What this means is that essentially you don't want your anti-rationalist picture to be globally anti-rationalist. Well, you just want it to be anti-global rationalism.
With a caveat. And that is, and I don't know whether this will affect your agreement or disagreement, but I agree with Hume and Wittgenstein and Ryle that at bottom, all of our practices are not rationally based.
Okay, so that's what I was about to. So I was about to get
now. Given that, internal to certain practices, reason is the governing modality, and ought to be the governing modality. So, within the framework of scientific discourse and inquiry, reason is the overriding modality and criterion. Within jurisprudence, certain brands of rationality, and by the way, it's interesting to note that what rational means in jurisprudence is very different from what it means in logic, right? Within jurisprudence, a certain kind of rationalism that is taking a certain kind of reason as being overriding is absolutely the case. But I agree with Hume and Wittgenstein at the meta level that ultimately human practice in general cannot be described as rational. It cannot be properly described as rational. Wittgenstein goes so far as to say that at the end of the day, once you pursue the reasons all the way down, and now you're at the point at which you're sort of seeing the whole, the things you're taking as givens, and the thing that ultimately we act blindly. If you're looking for ultimate at the end of the day, we simply act. Action comes first, and all the reasoning is simply one brand of it. Right.
Okay, then the question becomes, so it felt as though one thing so we mentioned 3 areas of philosophy where rationalism seems present. And the 3 areas are
mainline philosophy, yes. Yeah.
Epistemology, ethics, and political philosophy.
Right.
Now, the question we wanted to ask, I take it one of the very important questions we can still ask is rationalism appropriately applied, despite this criticism you've made about how we just act ultimately, or we ultimately are kind of blindly acting. You yourself have said rationalism makes sense within specific fields of inquiry, right?
Maybe we should be careful not to use the word rationalism too much. So let me qualify that. What I said is that the notion that reason should be overriding is appropriate within certain practices, yes.
Yes, exactly. And so
I don't think ethics is one of them necessarily.
I was going to say, we're still left with the question, right, of despite this kind of large-scale criticism that you've just launched by objecting to epistemology, rationalism about epistemology, right. We're still left with the discussion about is overriding reason still appropriately applied to such and such and such fields?
Absolutely. So it's an open question, right? So now that I've sort of gave the epistemic rationalism is the most general, it's the broadest, it's the widest in its scope. It really does encompass the entire rationalist picture of human beings, which, remember, is applied both to belief and to action, right?
Yeah.
It now still remains a question. Is reason plausibly overriding within certain areas within the area of action, let's say, whether the individual action, ethics, or collective sort of social action, which is political theory, politics? And my answer is going to be, again, in some cases yes, and in some cases no. Certainly in the case of individual action, I don't think that reason should always be overriding. And that is, I don't believe that moral considerations are always overriding. And in the case of politics, I also don't believe that moral consideration, that rational considerations should always be overriding. And so, no, I don't. In either of those areas, I think the rationalist is wrong in both of those areas. And I mean, I could talk about why, but that's the structure of my position.
Yeah, and so by reason being overriding in ethics, you're talking about duty being moral duty being overriding.
That's right.
To all other kinds of non-moral values.
Right. So when we look at the rationalist picture in general, right, then these virtues that follow from it, the picture that emerges is one in which, for the rationalist, because duty and the right and the good are the ultimate reasons for all our action, right? Serving the right and the good. Considerations of the right and the good are always overriding of all other considerations in action. Right? And so that includes things like matters of prudence. That includes things like matters of personal relationship and the like. Yes. And what I'm saying is I don't think that's true.
Yeah, so how about you go into why you don't think that's true, and then we can discuss some of the concerns.
Right. So I think one of the simplest ways into this is to sort of point out, while I think that there are certainly honest, in the sense of being truthful, rational ethicists, I don't think anybody actually is one, right? Because the giant sort of elephant in the room is that everyone, including the Peter Singers of the world, who are perhaps the best example of an ethical rationalist, everyone, every day, allows scores and scores of prudential values to override moral ones. Right? So someone decides to drive somewhere instead of take the bus. Someone decides to shop at Walmart instead of driving an hour and a half to a local mom and pop store, which, by the way, in the Midwest, many people are in this position. Someone decides to, like in my position, decides to copy and paste comments into student papers rather than write every single comment from scratch, right? In each of these cases, I would argue one can identify a moral duty that one is allowing a prudential consideration to override. Okay? Mm-hmm. And what I would argue is that stuff like that, every single one of us does every single day. Mm-hmm. Right? So I just think that as a sheer matter of plain fact, no one actually is an ethical rationalist, right?
No one's an ideal rationalist. Yeah.
No one actually acts out. No one actually lives out a rational.
No one is the ideal.
Right.
No one is the ideal. But obviously, the rationalist doesn't have a problem with that. With the fact no one's an ideal.
Right.
Now, you have further criticisms here.
Although, right? Yeah, but let me. I'm not quite as happy to let that go. I mean, I had actually a back and forth with Massimo on this, and he tried to sort of throw this at me. I'm imperfect, right? That answer works once. It doesn't work twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 16 times, 30 times. In other words, I find it plausible to say, okay, this is the ideal, and yes, I went to Walmart this morning, but I'm a fallible being. I'm weak, right? It's wrong. I made a mistake. Okay, now that you've made the mistake, you've recognized and acknowledged that you've made the mistake. Presumably, you're not going to make it again, right? The fact that you then go do exactly the same thing next week, and then the week after, and then the week after that, you can't keep pulling out your imperfection as the explanation for this. I mean, that just starts to look really disingenuous after a while, and it almost looks like you're trying to avoid the obvious conclusion, and that is that the moral reason is not always overriding. that there are other competing values, like convenience, like cost, like any number.
In other words, maybe a way to put your objection here is something like, look, we can use, I mean, almost a cliche, like we can use actions to infer what someone actually believes.
Right.
And if your actions basically over time unfold such that it really looks like what you believe is that moral reasons aren't overriding,
right.
Come on, just fess up to it.
Right. Look, I am not, I'm going to get in trouble with Massimo. I am not accusing him of being explicitly disingenuous. I don't think he is. He's the last person I would say is being explicitly or consciously disingenuous. I think this is almost a structural kind of habit that we've fallen into. That is that we're simply, that we so are in the grip of a cherished idea that we'll do anything to avoid contradicting it. And I really do think that this notion that moral duty is always overriding is a very cherished idea by an awful lot of people, especially in mainline philosophy. And when you point out to them, you never act like this, their instinctive reaction is to say, is to find some way to explain that away without having to look hard at the cherished idea and say, is this really, I mean, what I really think or not? And so I think that the mere fact that every single person on a daily basis allows scores of prudential considerations and therefore prudential values to override moral obligations is a real reason for thinking that moral obligation is not always overriding. Yes, you can give these sort of answers in terms of person's imperfection or fallibility, but those answers ring very, very empty after a few times around. Then you start asking, well, wait a minute, you already acknowledged that this was wrong. You acknowledged you did it in a moment of weakness. How come you're weak so often? I mean, it almost sounds to me like you're starting to sound like someone who believes in original sin or something, right? I mean, that's what it starts.
I was actually about to say that, I'm pretty sure, certain religious people would find no issue or would completely think that your objection is
right. But notice the
just on the issue.
But notice the framework, right? In a Christian framework, I think that you can maintain the idea that moral duties are overriding, and you can give the fallibility answer because there's a rich background against which that makes sense. The idea of a fallen world and of fallen people, right? But the rationalist has no access to that kind of a framework.
The rationalist has access to, they can have access to a certain understanding of human nature, which is less than ideal. Which would entail a kind of consistent imperfection, but would still strive for an ideal.
But it would not, I don't think it would explain or would make sense of an ongoing imperfection with zero moral improvement. In other words, this guy's going to keep driving that car until he's 90 years old. Right? This guy's going to keep shopping at Walmart until he's 80 years old, right? I mean, in other words, it strikes me as highly suspicious that you just don't see any improvement with respect to these. Normally, when somebody recognizes a weakness that caused them to stumble on a duty, they work at it, and you find that it's not repeated, or if it's repeated, it's only repeated a few times. But these prudential considerations override all the time, and they always will. They're never, and so I just don't see the kind of arc.
Let's also be clear here, though, that there's a difference between talking about people who don't really consider things like rationalism at all and just live their lives, and then talking about people like Massimo, right?
Or any other philosopher.
Right, because I was going to say, someone like Massimo, definitely, I'm sure he could definitely point out to you all sorts of ways in which he's made improvements.
Yes, he has. I mean, he and I are going to do a dialogue in a few weeks on ethical veganism, which is where this whole argument came up.
He would say that he made an improvement there, right? Yeah. So he recognized that that's a perfect example, actually, for him, right? This was a big thing that he came to believe is morally wrong. He's a moral, and it actually took work for him to stop eating it.
Look, God forbid that I should try and give the implication that the view I'm presenting and the arguments I'm presenting are somehow knocked down completely. this is the way I see this stuff.
Yeah,
and I think I have a pretty good, and my own orientation is largely in contrast with it. And so, yes, of course, I'm not denying that there can't be responses to this, certainly, and certainly you're pointing at them. And I could see a position maybe that someone could put together in which even the persistent fallibility is explained in a way that doesn't seem to be explaining away. But needless to say, this is one of the things that sort of the overwhelming acceptance of prudential values as overriding across the span of our lives strikes me as one reason for thinking that moral values are not overriding.
Right.
Okay.
And by the way, I'm also not saying that I don't see the tug of your argument at all. I want to try, because I've been thinking about this a lot since we've been talking about it, and I'm trying to figure out where my own intuitions lie on this. And in order to get clear, I want to kind of parse out the different ways the rationalist theory would play out in someone like Massimo. And by the way, it's funny, it sounds like we're talking about Massimo like behind his back here. It's only
because he and I just had an exchange about this on his blog, and that he and I are going to have a conversation about this in 2 weeks. And so, don't worry, we're not talking behind his back.
We should have a shout out like, Massimo, we like you.
Right.
So cool.
So let me give you some of the other considerations.
Can I say one other thing?
Yes, please go ahead.
So one other thing I've been thinking about recently is, so when I first started learning about moral duty and stuff like that, and perhaps this could come from my kind of religious background from earlier on.
Well, you should tell people what you used to be an evangelical Christian.
Yeah, I used to be an evangelical Christian. That's right. And one of the things that the way that I understood moral duty when I first started learning about it in college, I think I understood it as like analytically true that if something was a moral duty, it was overriding.
Yeah.
It's actually very hard for me to make sense of what a moral duty is if it does not contain the notion of overriding. And this isn't just for conceptual reasons; it's almost for practical reasons too, right? Because if you don't think that moral duties conceptually contain this notion of like overridingness, then when I tell you, the function of saying you have a moral duty to do X is to say like that's overriding. Yeah. You have to do it. That's like the pragmatic function of the term.
Yeah.
And so if you lose this idea of overridingness, it becomes difficult for me to see how you can rescue the term instead of being an eliminativist about it.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. This is one of the reasons why when I pose this to people, they often are at a loss at how to reply.
Yeah, like 3 weeks, by the way.
Right, and Massimo also almost didn't know what to say to me when I challenged the notion that moral reasons are overriding, and
because it's almost like challenging bachelors and unmarried men.
Yes, and I would argue that I would point out that if you look at some of the other work that I've done and work that I'm in the process of doing, I'm in the process of asking myself whether I think there is actually any such thing as a moral obligation. If what you mean is what people typically mean by it. And I find that whenever I try to grab hold on the notion and make some sense of it, it slips out of my hands.
So you probably want to stick to something like there are moral reasons.
I actually think that really there are valuations, and that these valuations entail a whole panoply of obligations that have to compete with each other for our consideration. And that all have to compete with each other for our obedience. And that I don't think that there's any systematic way or rationalistic way of sorting them out. I think it's highly contingent, highly context sensitive, highly individual. And I guess I don't see any way around that. And some of the things that we've been talking about sort of pointed that, like something like the idea of a prudential consideration overriding a moral one. I'll give you another one. I think that aesthetic considerations, aesthetic and hedonic considerations often override moral ones. I don't know that I'd want to say to an ethical vegan that I don't think I have any duties to animals. But what I would say is that they don't override the other things that I value.
So I just realized a way actually to kind of launch the same kind of objection you did against the rational ethicist maybe against you, or the same strategy. So I guess what I was pointing out was ordinary language, and actually a lot of ordinary practices, kind of moral practices, involve deploying terms like duty in a very specific functional way. The way that implies overridingness, right? And this is ubiquitous. People invoke overridingness of moral duty all the time.
That's right.
So yes, there are these practices that involve what looks like people don't believe that moral duties are overriding, which is what you've pointed out. It's like continuing to just fuck up,
right?
Over and over. But then there's also this practice of ordinary language and holding people accountable and kind of ascribing moral duties, which is consistent with the view that duties are overriding. So now I'm a little less convinced by this method that you've used of looking to how people behave, because it looks like if you look closely enough, you can find behaviors that are consistent with both views.
Yeah, I guess this is ultimately a judgment call. You know, what you think follows from people's behavior. I mean, I would just point out is that, you know, you can add on top of the prudential values, you can add, like I said, aesthetic and hedonic values. And I said this to Massimo in our exchange. I said, look, you wear nice clothes. You drink good wine. You live in a nice apartment in Chelsea. You've made all sorts of choices that serve any number of hedonic values and aesthetic values, but which a hardcore utilitarian would argue are completely unjustifiable and are in defiance of fundamental moral values. I said to him, I said, you could have lived in a much cheaper apartment and given away that money to homeless people. The difference in homeless people. You could wear cheaper clothes. You could quit drinking wine. You could quit. In other words, I guess I just don't, and I don't want to push this too far because I think you're right. I think you're right that this is a matter of how we interpret people's behavior and what it entails and all that. But I just find there to be so many examples of prudential and other sorts of aesthetic and hedonic values overriding moral ones on a daily basis, on a massive scale, that it just seems to me that more plausible to conclude that the moral duty is overriding is a kind of self-flattery than it is any kind of reality about us. But again, I agree with you that that's disputable. And it's a matter of how you see this, and I would say not just what you can infer, but what you see in what people do. But let me give one more reason that's not along these lines. So this is the Susan Wolf stuff, right? So
get to this.
And this is probably should be the last thing we do, since this is at an hour and 40 minutes.
Man, this is so fun. Dude.
I know I can do this with you for 4 hours, and we have done it for 4 hours, but the audience doesn't want it for 4 hours. There is a further question as to whether what Wolf calls a moral saint is actually even an appealing character, right? And so one of the things, and again, you might say that this wouldn't necessarily be true in certain religious frameworks, but certainly in a normal, ordinary, secular framework, we would associate the ideal with that which we admire, okay? So the ideal person is an admirable person, right? And Susan Wolf in this paper is one of a handful of, I could probably list, a dozen articles across various subjects that have had just an enormous impact on the way that I think about philosophy. And Susan Wolf's paper, Moral Saints, is one of them. And what Susan Wolf actually says is that not only is the moral saint, what we've been calling the moral perfectionist, the moral rationalist, not admirable, it's the kind of person we actually really don't like at all. Certainly not somebody we want to hang out with. Certainly somebody we don't want around. And her argument is really very simple, and that is, she says, when one pursues morality in a single-minded way, and the way that the rationalist requires, when one treats moral obligation as always overriding and always strives to act on it, one thereby fails to cultivate all sorts of non-moral virtues, right? So one of the things that she points out is if one really believes that moral duty is overriding and practices it, you'll never have a champion. There'll never be any champion tennis players. There'll never be any master craftsmen. There'll never be any great artists. There'll never be any great novelists. There'll never be any great chefs. There'll never be any great anythings that involve the devotion of an enormous amount of time and energy and consideration to non-moral values, right? So whether to beauty, or whether to some form of entertainment or athleticism, or whether, in other words, all these sorts of things that we admire and that we like in people and that make people interesting and that make somebody a person you'd actually want to sit and have a conversation with or have a drink with or whatever, are precisely all those characteristics that represent the non-moral virtues. And I think we've all had the experience of being subjected to a kind of moralizer who is just the most tedious, awful, worst sort of person to sort of hang around. The person, who's constantly engaged in a kind of moral hectoring. I mean, you see this a lot today with, I guess today it's mostly, you see it with sort of social justice warriors. These people tend to be humorless. They tend to sort of, think about, you couldn't have great comedy, right? I mean, there's just so many things that there's so many activities and traits that not only we admire in people, but that we cherish in them, that would never arise if a person actually tried to live the way that a utilitarian or a Kantian told them to live. And so I think what Woolf does is she sort of raises the question, is the moral perfectionist admirable? And if it's not admirable, then how can we say it's an ideal? Right? Now, the reason I said that I could see how you might be able to say this in a religious framework is that in a religious framework, you could say that the ideal is really almost a non-human ideal. Right? But if we don't have that framework available, it's very odd that we would claim that something is an ideal, but if you ask, would you ever want to hang out with such a person? The answer is absolutely not, right? And I think Susan Wolf is pretty convincing that there aren't too many of us who'd want to hang out with moral saints.
So first, I just want to say I loved Susan Wolf's article. It's one of those. It's one of those
philosophy at its best, in my opinion.
Yeah, and also the other thing is it's tackling such huge monolithic traditions. I mean, she's attacking both the Kantian and utilitarian framework, all at once. And she does it in a way that I love as well. It's a way of it's not a way of changing you necessarily by premise, conclusion, argument. It's a way by changing the way that you see the world almost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Total frame of reference shift. She can
frame change. So I just wanted to say out front, I absolutely loved that paper, and it definitely has changed a lot of the way that I think about doing philosophy in the future as well. So anyway, I wanted to draw out a distinction between two different things that I think maybe might be confused together by viewers. I know they were for myself. So there's a difference so there are two potential bad states of affairs that could result from being a moral saint on the utilitarian or the Kantian framework. One is the world ends up sucking, and the other is the person ends up sucking. And these are related, obviously, because the reason the world would end up sucking is because the people would end up sucking.
Right.
By the way, this is to use technical jargon.
Of course. You're being very sophisticated in your analysis. Yeah.
And so, to be clear, I think Wolf's criticism in her paper was primarily on you're going to become a sucky person. However, I think it lingers in the background, though I don't remember at least if she explicitly. Are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought you were frozen. You just weren't moving.
No. I'm listening raptly.
Great at playing dead.
I want to hear you say the word suck again.
Yeah.
Go on.
I think it was lurking in the background of Wolf's paper that, if you have all these shitty people or sucky people, you'll have a sucky world.
Yeah.
But the thrust, the way that she put the criticism was from an Aristotelian virtue ethicist perspective of, you won't have a good character if you shoot for these ideals. And so her thought was any moral theory which dictates that you strive for an ideal that's going to sacrifice, your character, that you're going to be a terrible person, essentially. That's a point against that moral theory. That's a reason to reject the moral theory.
That's right.
So I guess let me first ask you. So you'd want to add on top of that the world would also suck.
Yes, I think that a world in which there were no great chefs, there were no great athletes, there were no great humorists, and there were no, because everybody was busying about the business of advancing the supreme good, would be a horrible world that I don't think anybody would choose to live in. Let me just say, because you mentioned it, and I was going to actually sort of end with this, and that much of what I've said, I think, does advance a kind of Aristotelianism, right? Because one of the things that's so lovely about Aristotle's view, and that's sort of lost in these modern views, and really what we're talking about is modern philosophy. We're talking about philosophy since the Enlightenment, is precisely this notion of a balanced temperament and a balanced character, and the idea that immoderation of every type is bad, including moral immoderation. Aristotle equally condemns drunks and teetotalers, right? And I take the teetotaler as a kind of moral perfectionist, right? And so I think that not only do I think that this sort of rationalism in ethics is wrong-headed, I think that it's also very modern. Prior to the modern era, no one thought this way. I mean, I'm not saying that there weren't extreme moral philosophies in the ancient world, but the big ones, like Aristotle's, fully recognize that the human template is complex. There are many ways in which human beings can be excellent. Therefore, there are many distinct values to be pursued, and that the good, healthy person pursues them in balance, and not any one of them to an extreme. And I take the mainline tradition, modern mainline tradition, because of its rationalism, to recommend all sorts of extremes, whether it's in epistemology or whether it's in how we form our beliefs or whether it's in how we act, that I think someone like Aristotle would view as disfiguring and dysfunctional. And which I agree is which I also think are disfiguring and dysfunctional.
Yeah, one thing we had, I think, we probably shouldn't touch on the Wolf paper anymore, just because I know you're going to talk about this with Massimo, I think, in a dialogue. So we don't want to spoil all of that.
He and I are going to focus on the ethical veganism issue. Yes.
Yes, I don't want to spoil that content. So I guess one other thing that you and I had talked about, which I thought could be worth definitely bringing up and relate to something you just said, is philosophy definitely has, I think, a history of taking extreme positions in response to certain arguments or events in history.
Yeah.
And the thing that you and I discussed a little while back was in philosophy of mind. Sorry, airplane once again. In philosophy of mind, there was a huge backlash against behaviorism toward very strong nativism once Chomsky, laid out some of his arguments, like the poverty of stimulus. And what's also interesting is analytic philosophy has a certain sociological dimension to it, where if you don't endorse the popular view, you sometimes do sustain kind of academic ostracism.
Yeah.
And it actually can be harmful for your career. Yeah. And that was very much the case in philosophy of mind. If you flirted with behaviorism for a while, this is something Jesse Prinz noted when I interviewed him. If you flirted with behaviorism for a while, you were in trouble career-wise. People immediately assumed you were kind of a fool playing with some dead theories.
That's right.
That's right. Almost like playing with, maybe some kind of religious metaphysical theories at a secular institution. And so I do think it's possible that the same thing might have happened when it comes to rationalism.
I think it has. I mean, look, it's not an accident that this emerges in the Enlightenment, which is right after the scientific revolution, and in a sense, and maybe we'll finish on this. Much of what the scientific revolution the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, at one level, at a first-order level, are simply a rejection of previous conceptions of the universe on one hand and of politics on the other, right? So we used to think that the Earth was the center of the universe. The scientific revolution says no, it's not, right? The Earth is, sort of on the left in the corner somewhere. We used to think that monarchies are the best forms. That we should have monarchies as our governments. Well, now we think we should have liberal democracies as our governments. But at a deeper level, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution were also, in a sense, epistemological revolutions. They were revolutions with regard to how we should go about deciding these things.
Yeah.
And the reaction was against what I call, when I teach this stuff, an authority-based model of justification. So in the prior generation, in the prior era, in the Middle Ages, the basis upon which you decided what was true with regard to the cosmos, and on which you decided what was true with regard to political affairs, was largely rooted in the authority of institutions, traditions, and individuals. And these institutions and individuals and traditions impose their authority in a very authoritarian way. Yeah. And so I think that there is much, we could have had a whole other discussion of autonomy. Yeah. Which I also think the modern philosophy overstates, wildly overstates, and overvalues. But again, it's a kind of a reaction against a kind of a prior excessive lack of autonomy. Yeah. And so I think that both the case of reason and autonomy, that in both cases, reason and autonomy, the scientific and the revolution and the Enlightenment, if you look at them philosophically, represent a kind of overcorrection. Yeah. For a kind of authoritarianism, both in belief and with regard to social organization. That's entirely understandable. Yeah. What strikes me as not so understandable is how 600-700 years later, you're still peddling the same stuff. Even after all these people have pointed it out. So what kind of frustrates me perennially is how the very fundamental critiques of people like Hume and Wittgenstein are just plain ignored, right? And I think that does have a lot to do with the thing you said last, which has to do with professional considerations. And to do with sort of a kind of a self-preservation instinct on the part of disciplinary philosophy, that, gosh, if we accept too much, rational justification is our bread and butter, and if we accept too many of these critiques, it's going to be hard to justify all these philosophy jobs and all of these philosophy papers and all of this work that we do. Wittgenstein famously, quit after he was done and went off, and I think he was a gardener, and then he was a school teacher, and he did all sorts of other things. And Hume famously always talked about, when we leave, what we do when we leave the study. And so I do think that it's an overcompensation. I think it's an understandable one. I think it's more understandable in the 16 and 1700s than it's understandable in 2016, which is why I think it's still worth talking about. I mean, if this was just something that was in the immediate aftermath of the Enlightenment, I would have said, well, what do you expect? I mean, you just came off of 500 years, 1,000 years of medieval intellectual and social life. And then it would be a matter of purely historical interest, but it's still a very dominant trend today, to the point to which, by far, the most prominent ethicist on the scene is the most rationalistic one, and that's Peter Singer, right? And so I don't think that anybody can say, well, this is just a historical matter, and nobody's like that. Not only are people like this now, the most powerful, prominent people in the discipline are like this now. And so I think it remains to be a relevant critique. Yeah, no, I certainly agree. And even if it's wrong, it's a relevant critique. Right. Especially, you can if you go and you take 4 years of undergraduate with having already listened to this dialogue that we just had, you'll start to see evidence of the rationalist view coming out consistently throughout your education. Obviously, it's not as though analytic philosophy doesn't ever. There's a counterculture, but it's small. Right, but also, some of these guys are taught even by people who are rationalists. The rationalists just fundamentally will disagree with them or get rid of them.
So it's not as though, just to be clear, it's not like there's this burying conspiracy. It's just, but that isn't to say that there aren't sociological reasons for the persistence of the view as well.
Yeah.
It's almost a little bit like what happened to Wittgenstein. You seem to be the advocate of all the countercultures. That's what you are.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was trained in a very rationalistic environment, both at the University of Michigan and at the CUNY Graduate Center. When I came out of graduate school, I was a highly rationalistic philosopher. I was a Kantian in ethics, and I was a Platonist in philosophy of language and philosophy of mathematics, and I was certainly a sort of a foundationalist in epistemology. My drifting over to the what we're calling the counterculture, the anti-rationalist thread, took a long time. Partly it arose out of me being increasingly dissatisfied with the work I was doing and finding myself, increasingly skeptical. But it also had a lot to do with people I met in professional life. One person who I did a dialogue with on Wittgenstein, Ian Ground, had a huge impact on me in terms of my development. But there were others as well, some people who really influenced me. And also I did more reading. I didn't encounter Wittgenstein very much in college or graduate school, partly because he's really out of favor now. He was hugely in favor around the time of the Second World War, and then he's hugely up through the 60s and 70s, and now he's hugely out of favor. And so, although people like Paul Horwich are trying to rehabilitate him. Yeah. And so my journey away from precisely the tradition I criticized, I used to be.
Yeah.
And one of the most vehement proponents of it. And so my migration over to this countercultural view, as we'll call it, has been slow and only happened in my professional life. It did not happen before. My education trained me like a good rationalist philosophy foot soldier, and it took some deviant souls as well as a lot of reading to sort of pull me out of my dogmatic slumbers, as
Kant can't be tamed.
That's right. All right, I think we've done good, but I think if we do more, we won't be doing good. So I think we should probably call it, right?
Yeah, sounds good. So I guess if we continue to do these dialogues, we're gonna have to release a show name just for our dialogues.
That's right.
We've got some ideas, which I'm sure we'll share with people soon.
All right, my friend. So I look forward to talking with you again soon. I'll see you over the Electric Agora. I'm probably going to be coming to New York again sometime in April. And awesome. So we can spend another day overriding moral values. And
you're saying this live, man.
And I'll see you.
Yeah, sounds good, Dan.
All right, thank you so much.